And what is most important, I think, for people to recognize is that switching is exhausting. As a physician, you tend to be in the physician role. It has its own exhaustion, but you're not swapping out all of the time. So if you have clinic on Tuesday and you're in the C-suite on Wednesday, that by Friday, you're pretty wiped out. That's a very exhausting place to move from and to and back and forth. But I wonder if you ever, if you could share with us a little bit about the Firewoman and what that feels like.
It's interesting because during my interview, one of my fellow CMOs at another hospital said that a lot of your work is in putting out fires. And boy, does that ring true each and every day. And that's what makes the role interesting, right? There's never a dull moment. And it can be conflict mediation between two parties. It can be conflict mediation between two entities. But what is the common denominator there in terms of success in putting out the fires is you have good teams of people. You have people you trust, people who trust you. You know the appropriate stakeholders to bring to the table, and you know what's yours to solve and what isn't.
Hello and welcome to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. I'm your host, Lee Scheinbart, and along with the fabulous team at the CMO Group, we bring you the most crucial conversations in healthcare and physician leadership. The CMO Group is the only physician-run and physician-led organization focused on chief medical officers and exists to transform how physicians lead. The group helps CMOs and emerging physician leaders move from expert operators to enterprise leaders through a unique transformational process. Healthcare doesn't just need good doctors in leadership. It needs high-powered executives with deep medical knowledge. That transformation is the work of the CMO Group. Today's guest is Dr. Vidhya Prakash, the author of a brand new book and one I highly recommend to all of our listeners entitled The Leadership Learning Curve, a woman physician's journey as a chief medical officer. Dr. Prakash graduated from the fantastic and fabulous Ohio State University with a BA in English and later earned her medical degree from the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine. Dr. Prakash completed her internal medicine residency followed by infectious disease fellowship at the San Antonio Uniformed Services Health Education Consortium, and then served as an infectious diseases physician in the United States Air Force for 10 years on active duty status, retiring from military service in 2014 before joining Southern Illinois University's School of Medicine. And presently, Dr. Prakash is the Chief Medical Officer and Associate Dean of Clinical Affairs and Population Health at SIU Medicine. Vidhya, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Lee. I'm honored to be here with you.
So happy to have you. Listen, when I saw the title of that book on an email from the American Association for Physician Leadership, I knew instantly that I had to get a copy of it and read it, and I did. And after I read it, I thought to myself, that's the book all of us in this space have been looking for. Equal parts memoir, journalism, an encyclopedia. It's practical. But I think most importantly for myself and hopefully for the listeners, it's very honest and very authentic. How did you come to this project?
Thank you so much, Lee, for those kind words. I will start by saying that this book did not start out as a book. This book started as a journal written by a frantic new CMO who was desperately trying to find her footing and felt like she was floundering with every attempted step. And so what I did was, with every pearl or nugget that I learned or had to look up and learn, I wrote it down. And I wrote the reference down so that I could always go back to it. And over a period of 3 years, that list of pearls and nuggets and references evolved into something much bigger. And I realized that I had an opportunity to share that knowledge with others. And that's what led me to the AAPL, and here we are.
I love this idea of journaling turning into a book of sharing. Most of us who choose to journal or have had a diary keep that relatively private. Is journaling something you've always done your whole life?
I have always loved to write, and I don't think that's specific to journaling. I think that's just in general, whether it's jotting down private thoughts, whether it's writing a story. My outlet has always been writing. And therefore, I don't think this really comes as a surprise
Yeah.
that, that journal eventually evolved into a book because it started with my best outlet, which is writing.
And we are fellow Buckeyes. And as you earned your degree in English at Ohio State, did you ever think you would possibly write a book one day?
I never really thought about it, especially as an English major. It's interesting. A lot of people raise their eyebrows when they hear English major and medical doctor, but I really think that those two are so closely related because of the humanity aspect of being a doctor. And I really felt that that English major really helped me become a better communicator, helped me empathize better with my patients. And so I'm grateful. If I had to do it all over again, I would be an English major. And to answer your question, I never sought out to write a book with that English major. It was closely tied to the profession that I chose, which was being a doctor.
That's a great connection. And I agree with you that doctoring is a human experience,
Yes.
and learning about what it takes to be a better human, whether it's communication through the act of writing or speaking, connecting with other people, understanding the humanities as you describe it, are critical components. And I think this is going to convey to our listeners as we begin to talk about the book. So, one of the most interesting things that caught me very quickly is that you state one of the biggest misconceptions about chief medical officers is that perhaps they need to know everything. Someone begins to put that into our brain, or we put it into our own brain. When or how did you begin to realize that that is not exactly accurate, much less very fair?
I think that's a great question, Lee. And one chapter in my book, which is entitled Retreat, really gets to the heart of that question. And so I talk about how members of the executive leadership team, there were no more than 5 of us sitting around the table. We were talking about uh, an essential problem, which was making the revenue cycle more efficient. And when you break down the revenue cycle, it includes coding from the physicians, it includes billing from our billing experts, but salient pieces of that are access to care and the patient experience. And so all of us were sitting at this table looking at it as our problem to solve. And I took a step back and I realized, sure, ultimately we're responsible for solving the problem, but whose voices are missing at the table? The people most impacted by the problem, the people on the front line who see the challenges day in and day out and can really inform us and be a part of the solution. So, what did we do? We gathered the clinical practice together for a retreat. This included leadership from across all of the sectors and frontline clinical staff. And what emanated from that was a wonderful discussion, really highlighting what the real issues were. There were some technical issues where it gave us low hanging fruit and things that we could easily solve. But then there were more adaptive issues, such as what is the culture of our clinical practice? How do we communicate? And we realized that we have a lot of silo mentality, that our communication is oftentimes fragmented. And as a result, the people with the problem became the people with the solution. And so, fast forward a year later, as a result of that retreat and those stakeholders continuing to meet, that retreat wasn't a one and done. It was a kickoff to problem solving, long term problem solving. And so, we hired a deputy director of patient experience. That never would have happened had it not been for that retreat. Our coding and our clinical informatics teams began meeting very intentionally and frequently with the clinical departments to break down the communication gaps and break down the silos. And so, again, when I take a step back, had the 5 of us at that table tried to solve that problem, I can't even imagine. We never would have gotten to the point that we are now. So, certain things, actually, I would say 90% of things in my sphere, and I would say in clinical leadership, those problems are best solved by getting the right stakeholders together instead of me as the leader solving the problem.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And unfortunately, I think this is still embedded in just modern culture and organizational behavior, where leaders tend to think that they are the problem solver, And sometimes these things aren't problems to solve, they're problems to manage. And what you're describing is excellent management, using the strategy to communicate with the people who probably have a ton of ideas and solutions, and they're struggling to communicate that up. So to speak, to get to a better solution, maybe not the best, but better. Things don't always need to be perfect, but they do need to try to be better. So you really tackled that broadly. Was there anybody in that room of five or somewhere in your journal where the idea was, let's hear from people who are closest to this work? Do you remember how that evolved?
That actually evolved when the dean put me on the spot.
That's always a good place to be.
It was. And this is what I love about our current dean, Dr. Jerry Cruz, is that's how he leads. He gives you room to 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 come up with ideas, to make mistakes. He creates an atmosphere of psychological safety, which I think is really um, such an important part of leadership. And he sees who the quiet ones are in the room, and he seeks input. He knows how to draw you in, and make you feel like you're a part of the discussion. So I was one of the quiet ones at that time. I had a lot of imposterism where I felt like, do I really belong here? And I kept my mouth shut. And he put me on the spot. He said, Vidhya, what do you think? And that's when I brought up to the group, hey, what's wrong with this picture? It's the five of us trying to solve something that's a lot bigger than any of us, and who is missing from this table. And that's how the idea of the retreat came about.
It's brilliant and it's courageous. It's brilliant on its own merit. And it's been done in other organizations, but it's courageous where you have a leader who wants input from everybody in the room, which then provides you a sense of safety to then bring up this idea. The risk is you go out to the front lines and people throw all kinds of objects at you and they're not interested in the solution, or they're telling you what you're doing wrong. And so it clearly sounds like you have built and developed and grown a culture where people move information effectively in ways that lead to solutions. Does this ring true to you in any way?
Absolutely. And I think what's foundational to that, Lee, is trust. When I started my role, one of my biggest opportunities was to cultivate a sense of trust between all members of the clinical practice and the central leadership team. When I took on the role, there was very much an us versus them mentality, and the relationship was adversarial. Cultivating that sense of trust started with things like the retreat, where now our clinical practice felt that leadership is listening. They want to hear my perspective. And over that year, it was clear that we were able to help those ideas materialize into tangible wins that really helped move the clinical practice forward in a way that it had never moved before. So, listening and following through are key elements of building that trust, and importantly, caring, right? Listening is caring.
Yes, and I think you just outlined the real job description, and you and I have talked about this in the past a little bit, and you sort of anticipated where my mind was going. The job isn't to know everything. Clearly, we've articulated that. The job isn't to solve everything. The job is more about that connecting the space for safety, the development of trust. That's what I'm hearing. When did you begin to really understand there's the real job description that's on paper or in a digital file, and then there's this other job description? How did that transition occur to you?
I don't think there was any particular moment, Lee. As I hit the ground running, and I was really on a listening tour that first 90 days. Before acting, I was actively listening and understanding where the pain points were. And a lot of times when you take a step back and you see where some of the failures are, it's because there's a gap between your espoused mission, vision, and values and the reality, right? And so part of leadership, I realized, was not just being the great connector. with that retreat example, yes, I brought everybody along in the clinical practice and I connected all of those groups with executive leadership. And we were functioning as one cohesive team instead of several fragmented teams. But the other piece of that was in my leadership role, it's my responsibility to align everybody along our mission. And when I see tensions, 9 times out of 10, it's because there's misalignment between what the reality is and what the mission and the vision are. And so the constant resetting and let's bring it back to the mission. Why are we here? We're here for our patients and we're here for one another, right? And so realigning, along with connecting, really, I think, is the essence of the role.
I also agree with that, and everyone who listens to this show, they know there's a tremendous amount of misalignment in healthcare for a variety of reasons. Neither you nor I can solve this on this program, but what we can do is work locally with the people that we're working with and aligning people together. And I love that phrase. We're here for one another. I think that's been lost in modern medicine for quite some time. And I think that phrase should be used more and more, which reminds me of another phrase that you wrote about, because what we're talking about sounds relatively straightforward, but it's incredibly hard to do. And you wrote about this idea, this powerful phrase, that another part of the CMO's job is to hold the container and control the heat. So perhaps you could share what that is all about and how does that work in terms of actually doing the work that we're talking about.
Yeah, so this is from my adaptive leadership training, right? Being the holding container in any sort of adaptive work and controlling the heat. This work is not easy, Lee. You know that.
Yeah.
There's no part of this job that's easy. And that's what makes it fulfilling and frightening at the same time.
Yeah.
And I feel like in any sort of change in particular, anytime you're trying to transform, let's say, a clinical practice, in my case, there is going to be tension. You have to accept that there's going to be tension. And many times you're leading individuals who don't like tension and rail against it. And the knee-jerk reaction is to avoid the work. We're not going to look at the hard questions because that's going to cause tension. And we're going to scapegoat and blame this problem on anyone else but us. And just a whole host of other avoidance mechanisms to not answer the tough questions. So as the leader, so much of adaptive work, when you look at expectations of leadership, it's to provide direction, order, and protection, right? A lot of the adaptive work is going against that, which seems very counterintuitive. You release some of the direction and you give it to others. And you bring the tough questions to the forefront and you engage others and ask them to be a part of that. A healthy amount of disruption can be necessary as well. Disrupting traditional roles, letting voices that usually aren't at the table come to the table. And the protection piece as well, right? You're so used to protecting your team against these forces that can be harmful to them, but allowing them in a safe space to let some of those tensions and some of those adversarial forces come to the forefront and looking them straight in the eye is vitally important to change. And so those are all the ways in which you're turning up the heat, right? But with that disruption, sometimes you can get your team to a point where it becomes too much. And then you also have to realize when to lower the heat. So when do you bring back some direction, some order, some protection so that you don't overwhelm the team? And that's an art and a practice. There's no handbook for that. There's no rule book for that. But this really is the essence of adaptive work.
You hit on something. My mind is a little stunned. And I work with a lot of CMOs where we've had either we were born this way or we've been nurtured this way or been trained this way about protecting people and things do no harm and prevent harm. And it's very counterintuitive for a physician, especially a physician leader, to sort of hold that tension, hold that ambiguity, hold that moment, hold those disparate views, because we want to, quote, problem solve, make the diagnosis, institute the right therapy, and see a successful outcome. And that's a lot of doing. But what you're talking about is holding space, sitting with it, as uncomfortable as it may be, as hot as it may get. But that is this is why I refer to the book as a bit of an encyclopedia, because then you have to look at, okay, containing the heat. What does that mean? Because we're not trained this. I mean, maybe you were, but I kind of doubt it. I mean, you've got a rampant infection in a human being, and you're going to attack that infection with the weapons that you have at your disposal, or the supportive care. That's very, very different than just sitting back and going, so let's see what happens when sepsis evolves. Like, let's observe that.
Yes.
Like, we don't do that. But in leadership, we do want to bring in all of those organic behaviors and see what's happening in order to modulate and get to a better outcome, because human behavior is very messy, and it's very, very different than sort of our clinical training. Does any of this make sense to you?
It totally makes sense. It's not easy.
It's not easy, and we're not all equally capable of looking in the mirror, especially if somebody puts the mirror in front of us, developing that introspective self-awareness of what is my culpability or responsibility here to improve myself to be a better and more effective leader. That's what I'm hearing. Is that what you're suggesting?
It is.
Yeah.
I have to say, I love your let's let the sepsis evolve analogy, which as an ID doc, I cringe when I hear that. But it's so true, right? Physicianship, it's very linear in patient care. History of present illness, you gather all of the data, you put together your problem list, differential diagnosis, you order the tests, you render the treatment, and all in record time, right? Because what is the outcome? People die. People die. And that's been ingrained in us.
Right.
To step away from that to a very different way of looking at problems in leadership, that's a stretch.
That is, and that is this in my own way, and I won't superimpose. This is what I see in adaptive leadership in part. But physician leaders have to transform from being physicians into leaders. You can be both, but the idea of watching something as a physician for which you have the power, knowledge, cognitive skills, technical awareness to intercede, you must do that. That's your obligation. That's your oath. Do no harm, not let something bad happen. A leader, back to the earlier conversation, has to contain a lot of things, hold a lot of space for people to work through together to get to a better place. And in fact, I'd love for you to share so if physicians are in part technicians to solve technical problems, and we are encumbered with that when we move into leadership, maybe you could share the story about working with the residents and sort of this fail that occurred of trying to use a technical solution for a non-technical problem.
Yes. Yes. So this was another one that I mentioned in my book. I was a young associate program director, eager beaver, ready to get rolling. And the program director mentioned that our newly minted second year residents who were ready to take on a leadership position, working with brand new interns, were understandably nervous and petrified about moving into that role.
Petrified.
Petrified.
How many times were we all petrified at some point in our medical? Like many times.
Many times, countless, right? Countless. Yeah. And so what did I do? I went right into technical mode. I put together these elaborate scripts of different scenarios where you have the senior resident and an intern who's struggling with professionalism, a senior resident and an intern who's struggling with knowledge gaps. And I gathered the second year residents together for a retreat and made them act these scenarios out, thinking that that was the solution. And what evolved was a giggle fest. They had a great time with the scripts. They started poking fun at it, and nobody really got anything out of it. And so the following year, I observed the same program director. So he came into the room with no papers, and I thought, no, where's his lesson plan? Where are his sheets, right? This is the technical part of me. But he sat down, they all gathered around him, and he first acknowledged their accomplishments. He said, you've gotten to this point because you have more than proven yourselves. You've earned it. You are a senior resident. And then he asked them, what are your fears? And then he kept quiet the rest of the time, and he just let them talk. And it was raw. It was cathartic. It was exactly what they needed. That was really getting to the root, the heart of what the issue was, and listening and holding space. And that was my teaching moment for me, a big one, that I jumped right to technical without really stopping to consider what is the problem and who do I need to bring into this to hold space, to listen, and control heat.
I love it. There are some things you and I can teach, we can write about, we can prepare role playing, but sometimes you just have to jump in a little bit. And fortunately, we can make a mistake in such a way that nobody is harmed, nobody gets hurt. It's not like observing sepsis and watching something really awful happen. You can observe a room full of people and something really magical can happen. And that's okay. And learning on the job, some of these things, they stay with you forever. I'm glad you shared that story. I'm glad you wrote about that as well. There's something else that we need to bring our listeners into an awareness about. You shared with me that once upon a time you thought that the bulk of the role would be all about strategy and finance. And obviously, as we're talking today, it turns out to be a lot about people, human behavior, conflict, navigation, negotiation. So if there are listeners out there who are leaning into a CMO future, how might they rethink what they think they're signing up for versus the things you and I are sharing with them?
I think that's a very good question. And my advice would be to listen first and then act. So again, just like me with the residents and jumping in to solutions, what I failed to do was take a step back and listen and gather more input, um, and really try to define the problem. So much of our failure in leadership, from what I've observed, is not even jumping to solutions, but not even defining the problem appropriately. And so understanding what parts of the problem are technical, where there's a clearly defined problem and a clearly defined solution. The printer's broken. It's a clearly defined problem. I, as the person in a position of authority, need to get it fixed. Clearly defined solution, right? A senior resident being petrified about leading a team,
Yeah.
right? And supervising an intern. Are there pieces of that that are technical? Sure. But the large part of it is really adaptive. And so understanding which pieces I have authority to take control and which pieces are more adaptive, where I need to bring more stakeholders in, listen, and let more people be involved with the problem. That was a key part of my learning curve. And all the other stuff, the finance, the strategy, that was a steep learning curve too, but it wasn't the bulk of the job. The bulk of the job was knowing who my stakeholders are, knowing who the appropriate ones were to bring into the problem, and defining the problem correctly in the first place, which would set us for the best chance of success in developing solutions together, developing solutions collaboratively.
Yeah. And one of the net effects, intentional or unintentional, is trust building. All of that work amounts to a yield that pays dividends all along the course of whatever people are trying to accomplish. Now, there's a nuance here for some of our folks that I want to explore with you. There's a small risk that if you're on a listening tour for 90 days, you're listening to the different issues that are there and you're looking on your job description and you're not finding this skill, this technique. And then you realize there's this tension or this heat and you lean into it, and you've written about leaning into discomfort. And sort of the risk is people think you're not doing anything. Like you haven't solved a single problem. You used to round on 25 patients and look at what you could do in a day. And now you're not doing, now you're not doing any. So how do you as the leader know that you are doing the right work that's not written in the job description versus avoiding it. And hinted at it earlier in the show. How do you, Vidya, recognize that you're doing the right work and articulating to your boss or your boss's boss or your peer group that you're doing the work?
Great question. I think in leadership, there is no such thing as over communication. And I see that struggle even now. There, especially around change, there's a lot of anxiety around, are you sure we should communicate this? Does this really need to go out? And my opinion, and from everything that I've experienced in this role, is that you actually get in more trouble when you don't communicate than when you do. So let's take, for example, my first 90 days and my listening tour. I would send frequent communication back to whatever groups I was talking to about, this is what we talked about and this is what I heard. Correct me if I'm wrong. And these are some of the things that I'd like to engage you in further to help solve some of these problems. And here's some of the low-hanging fruit where we've been able to tackle some of the issues that you brought to my attention. I actually did, I'm chuckling when I say this, a hostile takeover of one of our marketing newsletters that was sent out regularly. It was for the clinical practice. And I said, the CMO needs to take charge of that. I want to be able to be the one who narrates that. And that's another way in which I'm sharing with my clinical practice how much I've listened and what's been accomplished and what's in the works. It's interesting because we started doing town halls early on for this very reason, because I wanted people to know that I was listening and I wanted their input. The first town hall was very well attended, and then it started dwindling. Not because people didn't care, not because they didn't want to be a part of the conversation, but we were so taxed in clinic and dealing with staffing shortages that staff, in particular frontline staff, if the decision was between attending a 1-hour town hall or working on their burgeoning list of tasks, they were going to choose the latter. So what did we do? That was kind of a fail, right? So we pivoted. We started walking around the clinical practice. And what we do is we have a note taker with our core team, and we write down everything that everybody has said. And those are items that we follow up on. And we circle back to whoever it was that made the comment, who had the suggestion, to make sure the loop is closed. So it's a long-winded way of saying that communication. There's no such thing as over communicating in this work.
Yes. And in addition, to round this out, it's also when you are listening, whether you're at, you go to someone or someone comes to you, effectively manage what you hear and close that loop through communication.
Yes.
Because so there's two competing things. If the speakers feel like it's falling on deaf ears and never gets resolved, or there is no feedback or communication, hey, we did bring up your point. Here's what I advocated for. We're not going to be able to solve it right now. We're going to put this, to the next quarter. But here's the other thing we were able to do. If you don't close that loop, people will quickly find something else to do with their time. They won't trust you. They won't believe in you. They won't give you any sense of credibility. And you bring up the really valuable point, which is still active almost everywhere in healthcare. There are other competing uses of my time, like working out an immediate problem, an event, a staffing shortage. So I've got to choose, where's my time spent? If you don't make the time in the room valuable by fixing things, solving things down the road and communicating it, they will see no value in showing up, to your point. And it's not that they dislike it, but they have something that's immediately more tangible, like going to where the staffing ratio issue needs all hands on deck. Am I making sense here?
Absolutely. And I think this brings us back to trust, Lee.
Yeah.
Have you ever, I don't mention this in my book, but this has been something that's been very valuable to me in leadership. Have you ever heard of the Thin Book of Trust?
I have not.
Yeah, it's a great book. It's a little book, so easy to read and great for retreats for teams. So the Thin Book of Trust talks about how trust is built on 4 key pillars. First and foremost is care. People need to know that you care about them, that you generally care about their well-being, that you care about them as professionals, and people with lives. outside of the workplace. The other one is sincerity. People need to know you say what you mean and you mean what you say. The third is reliability. And so a lot of what we're talking about with the communication loop, that's showing them that you're reliable, that you're not going to drop the ball on things, that you're listening and you're following up on it. And the last is competence. They need to know that you know what you're talking about. And so much, everything that we've talked about so much, not just for this particular issue on communication, but leadership in general, those are the 4 key areas that you need to really nail in order to garner trust, not just for your immediate team, but for the people that you're leading, the masses.
When did you come into awareness of the existence of this book?
It was from another retreat that I was a part of at our institution. And it's one that really resonates with my team. I shared it with my team, and there were so many aha moments about it, especially in those specific areas where there can be breakdown of trust. All it takes is one of those areas to break down trust. You can know that someone cares about you and that they're sincere and competent. But if you're not reliable, you lose someone's trust.
That's right. That's right. Well, we have 2 more topics that I need to ask you about before we get to the end of our program. And it all fits with what we're talking from adapting, as a physician to a leader to becoming a physician leader. So that involves shifting roles. And CMOs in particular will shift a lot. And you've written about this. And one day you're a clinician, one day you're a negotiator, one day you're a listener, one day you're a facilitator. And in your case, you describe, your role as a mom, your role as a wife, and something you describe as the firewoman, if I recall.
Yes.
So how do you recognize, and maybe you can expand on firewoman, but how did you recognize, and how would our listeners recognize which role is required?
That's a tough one, Lee. And that's not one that I can answer immediately. What helps me though? We talked about mission, vision, and values. There's the mission, vision, and values of the organization, and there's your own values. And always bringing it back to your personal values and that of the organization or your family or whatever sphere it is that you're leading it. I don't fail when I bring it back to the values and aligning everybody along those values to complete the work in whatever sphere I'm leading in. It's interesting that you brought up role. I'm going to share an area where I struggled, which is where I took on the role of chief medical officer, and I'm still a physician in the infectious diseases division. And for a while, I was attending their monthly meetings, and I would hear about the myriad of problems that were going on in infectious diseases. I personally had a really hard time navigating that tension because in that room, I'm an ID doc. I'm not the CMO. And I thought, if this group has the privilege of my listening in and handling all of their problems, that's not really fair to any of the other divisions or departments that I'm leading. And so I made a conscious decision to step back from that because I couldn't be objective. I couldn't just be an ID doc without being a CMO in that sphere. So a lot of my role navigation had to do with what hat am I wearing in this space? Am I wearing a CMO hat? Am I wearing an ID doc hat? Am I wearing a mentor hat? There are so many times when somebody comes to me for advice, I tell them very deliberately, I'm not a CMO right now. I'm your colleague and your mentor, and I'm giving you advice. Don't take this as coming from the CMO. And that's something I continue to navigate with some difficulty. That's hard. It's hard to do.
It is the number one question that I receive from a variety of experiences as to, should I continue to be a practitioner as well as a physician leader? And what does that look and feel like? And it means different things to different people and different ecosystems and environments. And you are far from alone in both struggling and sharing that difficulty. It speaks to our identity, because we're oftentimes very much identified as a practitioner of medicine, a physician. When I introduce myself, or at least in the past, I'm an oncologist. Now I say I'm a recovering oncologist. But it identifies and people understand immediately. I don't say, oh, I'm currently serving in the role of chief health, blah, 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 blah. I identify with who I am as a physician. So this is universal in my experience. I would love for you to share with our listeners one last item. If there was a skill or a mindset that perhaps they ought to try to develop a little bit or begin to explore before they sign up to be the CMO. There are plenty of struggles they're going to have. There's no getting around that. But if they could really try to work on one thing before they take on the role, any idea what you might recommend?
I'm going to back up to your last point, and then I'll answer this question.
Please.
So about practicing as a physician leader, what did I say over and over again during my CMO interviews? I will not be a doctor. I said that over and over again, partly because I love it. I can't imagine not taking care of patients. It gives me such joy and fulfillment. I love teaching. I love having residents and medical students and fellows with me. And I feel in my institution, I would lose credibility if I wasn't in the heart of patient care for the people that I'm leading. So for all of those reasons, I said I will not be a doctor. To your last question, I've talked about listening, and let go of perfection. If you're not taking risks and you're not failing, you're not doing the work. Failure is an essential part of the journey, and that's where the growth happens, and it's to the benefit of the practice. It sounds counterintuitive, especially for a physician where there's no room for error. But in our sphere as leaders, you absolutely need to embrace failure as a part of the journey.
Yes. And that's the work of the CMO group, the transformation of being able to allow for certain behaviors that aren't allowed when you're taking care of patients, when you're wearing your stethoscope, when you have your scrubs, your white coat on. There are certain things that are required of that role. And there are equally important requirements of the leadership role, but sometimes they're not the same requirement. And what is most important, I think, for people to recognize is and you still owe us one explanation we'll get to in a minute, that switching is exhausting. As a physician, you tend to be in the physician role. It has its own exhaustion, but you're not swapping out all of the time. So if you have clinic on Tuesday and you're in the C-suite on Wednesday, that by Friday, you're pretty wiped out. That's a very exhausting place to move from and to and back and forth. But I wonder if you could share with us a little bit about the Firewoman and what that feels like.
It's interesting because during my interview, one of my fellow CMOs at another hospital said that a lot of your work is in putting out fires. And boy, does that ring true each and every day. And that's what makes the role interesting, right? There's never a dull moment. And it can be conflict mediation between two parties. It can be conflict mediation between two entities. But what is the common denominator there in terms of success in putting out the fires? Is you have good teams of people. You have people you trust, people who trust you. You know the appropriate stakeholders to bring to the table, and you know what's yours to solve and what isn't.
That's nicely put. And that's why we call it the fire chief, because you're the chief of all the firefighters and you're putting them out right alongside everybody else.
Yes.
Do you have any last thoughts or words before we wrap?
I don't. Lee, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, the pleasure is all mine. I love your book. I highly recommend it. You have my full endorsement. You've earned the honorary fire chief badge. That goes without saying. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for sharing your stories and your reflections about being a woman in physician leadership, particularly as a chief medical officer, with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, you have been listening to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the chief medical officer. You want to learn more about life as a woman CMO, as a firewoman in particular. You want to share your own stories with someone who can relate, then contact Vidhya on LinkedIn. If you want to learn more about your own physician leadership development and how to transform yourself and become a CMO, then contact me and I'll set you up with the CMO group and everything you need to lead in healthcare. I love talking with CMOs from all over the world. So get out there, be a firewoman, be a fireman, contain some heat, be a listener, set your people up for success. But remember, whatever you do, look out for yourself and be good to others out there. Thank you for listening.